Alright, hey guys, welcome to my overall Makerpen tutorial. Now, to start off this video, obviously, we're going to need you to get out your Makerpen. So, what you're going to want to do is open out your watch, and on the main page here, your backpack, open that, and hit use on the Makerpen. Now, if you have your Makerpen favorited, you can simply pull it from behind your back. Now, whenever you flick up your Makerpen, you'll be brought to this menu. This menu will have your actions, your modes, open palette, snapping, and these two buttons here. Modes we will be going over briefly. Open palette we will be going over briefly as well. Now snapping, there are three types of snapping. You have grid snapping, which will keep your object set on a grid so it's perfect always. Now there's settings to these grids. We will be going over those settings in the open palette menu. The other snapping object is surface. Surface will let you make your object based upon the surface of an item. Granted, this object may not be perfect always. Notice how it's slightly slanted, rotated in the room? Well, that's because you didn't make it on grid. If you make it on grid, here's a perfect square. Compare the difference here of the rotation. Now the next snapping is just simply off. This is a bit wonky nonetheless and rarely used, but it can be used for some organic effects like making terrain or organisms. Now moving on to these two buttons here, you have your world space, which will allow you to keep all of your objects on the same grid and keep things aligned. Now you have the gadgets visible option, which if you click on this button and you have it unticked, you see how the roll chips disappear and reappear over there? Whenever you have it ticked, you can see them. Whenever you have it unticked, you cannot see gadgets. This can be pretty useful if you're working in a room where the gadgets are cram-packed and you need to be able to see an object in front of you and the gadgets are in the way and you don't want to move your gadgets. Just simply hide your gadgets. And now, last but not least, you have the actions menu. The actions will allow you to hit done editing if you're working within a merge of the editing object, or it'll allow you to undo and redo your actions. If you undo what I just did, I had these two cubes here for my last segment. If I hit undo, last action I did was delete these. If I hit undo, it brings them back. It undoes the deletion that I did. If I hit redo, it redeletes them. The first thing you see whenever you flick up your Makerpen is the modes of your Makerpen. We have edit, create, select, move, rotate, scale, wire, configure, clone, recolor, freeze, delete, manipulate, and make invention. All of these modes we will be going over during this video. The first one that we will be going over is create. Create allows you to create the shapes, the gadgets, the props, and inventions inside of your Makerpen palette. Once you open palette, you will immediately be shown the shapes, and the default selection for shapes is cube. Now, in the name of the mode, we are creating an object, and in this case, I created a cube. Now, if we drop our Makerpen, we can use the next mode that we will go over here, select, and we can select the object, and it'll give us options of the Makerpen. We can eyedrop the material and color, which you will be able to find in your Makerpen under this eyedropper icon here. So if we hit eyedrop, this cube is a cardboard material in orange color. Now, if we go to options again and hit copy, this will go to our clipboard under our Makerpen. And we can spawn it in here, which is an identical clone to this cube. Now, also with the select button, you can select both objects, and to save ink in your map, if you hit merge shapes, these shapes are now bound together as one. Whenever you move them, they move symmetrically. And on top of that, if you merge shapes though, they bring over the same configuration options. Now, The next mode we will be going over is Move. Move allows you to move your object anywhere in the play space of your map, horizontally or vertically. Now, Rotate Now the next mode we will be going over is Rotate. Rotate is very similar to Move. Rotate rotates your object by a set amount of degrees that you can edit inside of the settings of your Makerpen. We'll be going over that later though. Now the next mode is Scale. Scale will scale your object based upon where you move it. If you move it up, it'll scale it larger. If you move it down, it'll scale your object smaller. From the middle will always be symmetrical. From top, you'll be scaling the top of your objects more. From the right, you'll be scaling the right of your objects. Now, the next mode on your Makerpen is Wire. Wire is what you use for the gadgets portion of the Makerpen. The gadgets are the logic behind your room and how it functions. We will not be getting very deep into gadgets for this, but for example, if we go to other chips here and bring out a state machine and spawn in a state, and we use the wire tool here, we can wire this state machine to the state. And you see how this wire here spawns? That is what the wire tool does. Now, the next mode is Configure. If we configure this merge here, we have a settings menu pop up. Now, the shape settings, we get the physics mode, which we are currently by default set to environmental. If we set it to decoration, which takes up less ink, your shape loses all collisions and physics behind it. You can walk through them and even throw objects through them. Now, going further down on the physics mode, we have the physics mode physical, which gives your object physics. See how it fell? And if you walk into it, it'll move around. Now, if you use the physics mode sticky, if a player grabs this by going further down to the basic settings and turning on the is grabbable object, you can put it onto with the sticky version and have it stick onto your player. Now granted, sticky and physical take up a lot of ink in your room, and on top of that, can create some undesirable lag sometimes. Now if we disable is grabbable and we turn on is climbable and set this to environment, you can climb onto your object. So if you attach some gadgets to this that would give your object some animations or movement, you can grab onto it and it'll move you around the map. On top of that, you can simply use this as a ladder and climb up it on your map. Now, supports wall run will allow your character to wall run on it. If you disable that, people cannot. Supports clambering / teleporting will allow people just to teleport on top of it if they're on teleport mode, or for walk players to automatically clamber on top of it like that. Now, nav mesh generation mode makes it so if you have it set to generate, whenever you generate the nav mesh, which is for AIs such as the goblins, if you're trying to make a quest, if you set it to generate, it'll create a walk path for AIs on top of you. If you hit ignore, it simply will just not recognize these. It will simply not create a nav mesh on these things, so AIs have to walk around them, and if you hit block, AIs will get stuck on here because it'll simply completely ignore them. Now, if you have RecRoom Plus, you'll have the room key objects, which is how you make it so players must pay RecRoom tokens to pick up this object or do anything with this object. Now, the next setting we have is the tags. If you give your object a tag, trigger volumes, if you have an object trigger volumes will pick up that tag, and you can do some pretty neat things with this with the gadgets. Now, with the free settings, getting into free settings, there is a mode on here, but you can do it through configuration. If you make it frozen, if somebody gets out the Makerpen, you cannot do anything to this object unless unfrozen. which we froze this to the configuration menus. If you slide it back over, it's now unfrozen, and you can edit it within it. Now, the respawn settings. If you enable this, your object will respawn if it's grabbable and a player moves it around the map, and you want it to always return to this exact location. You can edit the timing of it. By default, it respawns here by 15 seconds, at maximum 30, minimum 1. Now, the last setting here is tool settings. You can hide your objects during games, so whenever you start the game, this does not even appear to your players. Now, the next mode on your Makerpen is clone. When cloning an object, you can clone them regularly, like this, so it's the exact same thing, but moved over, or by using the one where the 2 arrows facing a little line there, you can mirror clone it, so it's the same shape, but flipped 180 degrees. Now you can do this up and down like that, or like this, to create some pretty unique art. Noticing how this is 100% symmetrical all over. Now, the next mode on your Makerpen is recolor. Recolor allows you to open up your palette and recolor the materials and the color of your objects. So if we wanted to, we could recolor this to neon ochre, and now our squares look like this. Pretty neat. Now, the freeze mode, which we already have slightly gone over in configure, allows you to manually freeze it without going to the configuration menu, and you cannot do anything to this object until you unfreeze it, which can prevent griefers from your map joining and editing what you don't want, or just unwanted modifications done by friends that they might have accidentally done without knowing. Is delete. Delete does simply as the name states. It deletes your object. Deleting your object will save ink on your map, but also will completely remove it from your map. Now the next mode is manipulate. Manipulate allows you to manipulate your shape vertically, horizontally, increasing the length or decreasing it, so you can get some pretty exact things for your object. Now, the final mode here is Make Invention. If you select, I have Make Inventions disabled in this room, but if you enable them, you can click this button and then select a bunch of objects, and if you make it as an invention, you can allow other players to find it on the invention store on RecRoom, or you can sell it with RecRoom Plus for tokens to other players. Now, in the menu of your Makerpen, you have your shapes, which is how you build stuff in the game, your gadgets, which is the logic of the Makerpen, your props, and your inventions. But you also have your settings. Your settings are going to be what you need to modify to use the Makerpen to the fullest extent in your room. With RecRoom, when making a room, one thing that you need to be very wary of is your ink limit. You have up to 100%, and once you get to 100%, you cannot create more objects in your room. Under your settings of the Makerpen, you have the first page of 3 pages of settings in the Makerpen. I'll be going over if each one of these settings do. So, don't rotate while moving. Don't rotate while moving makes it so whenever you move your physical hand, it rotates your object. If you enable it, like this, it does not rotate anymore. Enable self-scaling. This is a VR only option. So what you want to do is, once you have this enabled and you have your Makerpen out, if you use both of the grab buttons, you can scale yourself large, so everything around you shrinks, or you can scale yourself tiny, so everything around you gets larger. Now this can be used in a variety of ways, but usually it's useful for helping to detail maps. Setting is create grabbable objects. Now this setting I would recommend keeping to object default or off. Making it on allows players to pick up your creations, which can result in some undesirable results. Then you have your position snap, which this only works if you have grid enabled. Snapping on your Makerpen set the grid. So you'll be changing this a lot once you get advanced with the Makerpen. Usually I'll use 5 for most of my builds, but if I want to be precise, I'll usually move it down to 1, and if I want to be detailed, you can move it up to 0.5. Now, it'll move it by 100 grid blocks, depending on each one, if your snapping is set to 100. Next, we have rotation snap. Now, rotation snap is simply position snap, but for the rotation mode. If you're using 5 degrees, it'll rotate your object by 5 degrees at a time. While if you use 15, it'll rotate by 15 degrees, 30 degrees, 30 degrees, and so on. All the way up to 90 degrees. Now, the next setting is called uniform shapes. Uniform shapes makes it so whenever you use the create mode on the Makerpen, it makes your object uniform or perfectly symmetrical all over. So you can see this example with a cube. This is a perfect cube, but if I turn this setting off, whenever I make a cube, this is no longer a perfect cube. This setting applies to the wedge and all shapes, as a matter of fact. But this setting can also be very useful with tubing. So if you go to your shapes and use a shape tubing with uniform shapes on, it'll make it so your shape is a solid line with it. Always, no matter what, your shape will be a solid, straightforward line. Alright, so the next 3 settings all fall under this grid category. So if you show grid enabled, whenever you use the snapping of grid here, you can see the grid on the ground. So, align to edges makes it so whenever you have your grid enabled, it'll snap the object to the edge. And for snap to center, it'll snap your object, well, your shape, to the center. Alright, now we're on to the second page of settings. To get there, simply tap the right arrow. Now, for tube size, this will edit the thickness of your tube. 1 centimeter being the smallest, and so up to 25 centimeters being the largest. Fixed tube width is a setting that changes the tube size without having to manually change it, based upon the sensitivity on your trigger. So if you keep it 100% down, it'll be this thick with 25 centimeters, but if you have it, you see, it's just based upon the sensitivity of your triggers. Connect nearby tubes makes it so if you draw out with a tube and you finish it, you can connect the next tube to it just like that to create some cool piping effects. Smooth tubes makes it so here you can kind of see the edges of the tube, but with smooth tubes it tries to smoothen them out and adds this rounded part to the top of your tube. Tube height ratio edits the overall height of your tube. This is a 100% tube height, and by lowering the percentage, it lowers the height. So and so to 10, here's 10%. Tube faucets is the amount of sides your tube has. 10 faucets being the most, and 3 through 6 faucets being the same amount of ink. 6 faucets looks like this, all the way down to 3 faucets, which is a triangle. Next setting is drag select size. Drag select size is a setting for the select button on the Makerpen. Now, what it does is it edits the size of the sphere at the end of your selection to grab a group of objects while holding down your trigger. Large is the largest option, all the way down to precision, which is the smallest option. This can be very useful while trying to detail your builds. You may be moving the slider a lot, or you might not at all. Now here on my builds, you can't really select anything because everything in this room is frozen. Now the next setting we have is Show Pivot. Show Pivot allows you to simply see the pivot of your shape. So whenever you draw a shape out, there's the pivot, this white square here in the middle. Now the next setting we have is Rotate Around Pivot. Rotate Around Pivot will make this the center of your rotation of your shape. So whenever you go use the rotate mode, it rotates simply around that pivot instead of around the middle of the shape. The next two settings of your Makerpen are pretty straightforward. Show gadgets when not holding Makerpen. When enabled, if you drop your Makerpen, you can still see this gadget right here without holding your Makerpen. Now Show Selection Boundaries allows you to be able to see the overall volume of your merged objects. Now this is the entirety of this merge. Each shape inside of this merge, volume combined. It shows you with these green outlines here.